Welcome back, friends, to the Global Glory Chasers podcast. I'm your host, Dorina Lazo Gilmore-Young. Join us for an adventure feasting on the glory of God. I've been hosting these conversations for this season with artists, chefs, authors, teachers, and others about food, books, and travel, some of my favorite things to talk about, and how they are connected to our faith. And so if you are interested in the Imago Dei, the image of God in the peoples and cultures around the world, these are conversations that are here to guide you and inspire you. And I want to remind you that you can subscribe to the podcast. That way you won't miss any of the episodes. We have one more episode after this one, and then a special 4-part series that I do every year for Advent. Today, I'm actually welcoming a dear friend of mine. Shawna Sullivan is a mom, a home educator for 4 children. And after 13 years, she traded the hustle and bustle of New York City for the suburbs of North Texas. I'm excited to hear more about that story. She will never take a backyard, time with family, air conditioning, or her own laundry for granted, is what she says. And Shawna now is writing regularly for Family Christian online. Her passion is for living faithfully, not perfectly. And that informs her words and her ministry and her life. And I know I personally have learned so much from her. She is married to her husband, David. This week, that's 21 years that they've been married, and they are working together to write a book and a curriculum with plans of launching a podcast in the new year. They are so much about encouraging and equipping others towards a life of faithful stewardship, which we're going to talk about today in our episode. And they really help to guide people as they make decisions about their time, their money, and their talents. And Shawna loves connecting with readers through Instagram. She also has a biweekly newsletter, which I get, called First Things First. And she shares practical resources and real life applications in that newsletter. Shawna, I'm so excited that you are here with me, friend. Will you share a little bit about what season of life you are in?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Dorina. This was a super fun podcast to prepare for and think about. So as you said, this week we'll be celebrating 21 years of marriage. I have 4 children. So my baby is 9 years old now. And then I go up to 12, 14, and my oldest is a senior. She's 17 and will be graduating and launching this year. Cue the tears.
Oh my
But
goodness.
as with everyone, I wear multiple hats. As you mentioned, I homeschool. So I'm a homeschool mom, which really does take most of my focus and energy during the day. But I love discipleship. I lead a group of middle school girls on Wednesday nights. And then God has given me an opportunity to speak and write just as an extension of my ministry at home and locally. So as you mentioned, my husband and I are working on a book. And we are praying about launching a podcast in the new year that we're super excited about. And just wanting to encourage others, like re-envision what a rich and meaningful life can look like in light of eternity. But we're talking about food today, and I was thinking, what season am I in? I am in a season of a full table, is what I'm in.
I love that.
So hosting friends and family, and our table is full. So
it's beautiful. And I love you are such a hostess with the mostest, and at the same time, very realistic about what that looks like with kids coming in and out. So
yes.
As we get into it a little bit, I wonder if you could share with us, what is your cultural background, ethnicity, family, any geographical ties, perhaps?
Yes. So personally, for my husband and I, our ancestry is pretty much English and Irish. So that can be a little homogenous, but our extended family, our siblings, cousins are dispersed geographically and diverse culturally, which makes it really fun. We have family all over the country, all over the world, LA, London, New York City, and again, we're here in Dallas, Texas. Several of our family members have married families from Colombia, the Philippines, and even New Zealand. So our extended holiday gatherings are incredibly diverse and very fun culturally.
Oh, I love that. I bet that plays out for some fun things at the table too that you get to eat. Give us a context of where you grew up. Was there a specific city or a place that you were rooted in?
Yeah. So, growing up, it was full of adventure. I'll look at it that way. But my dad was an entrepreneur and a risk taker. Growing up, I moved 17 times in 13 years. And even though I was born in Texas, like it's a fact that we've added it up. I was born in Texas, but over the course of my life, we've lived in Colorado and California, but Southern California. So I think I would say I felt rooted in Texas, but it was super valuable and definitely formative for me to have experienced other cultures, even within the United States in different geographical regions. And I think it actually kind of drives home that we may feel at home in a place, but really it can be so temporary and transient, if that makes sense.
I think our sense of home is often tied to our cultural roots, but then also it could be to any geographical place, a certain home, a certain neighborhood. And so we each kind of define that in different ways. Now, I know your family has lived in some different cities as well. We mentioned that as we were introducing you. So tell us about some of the cities where you have lived and how that has shaped your view of God's glory.
For high school, I was in the suburbs of Dallas, and then I ended up working after grad school in Austin, Texas, where I began my professional career. But then the Lord saw it good after my husband and I married to move us to Manhattan. So I go from the wide open spaces of the suburbs of Dallas to this urban center of Manhattan. And that is where we decided, and the Lord blessed us with a family. And to say that we learned a lot about God's glory living in Manhattan is an understatement. I think we could write multiple books about that, which we're trying. But when you think about Manhattan, I mean, there's almost 9 million people that live there. And between Manhattan and the 5 boroughs that make up New York City, something that was fascinating for me was just living among this melting pot of cultures, and that our church and our community was united in our faith in Christ, but we were so diverse culturally. And I remember having my first child, and friends of ours that were from South Africa brought a traditional South African dish. And we have friends from Puerto Rico and all over the world that would be in the city for a time and then move back to their home country. And it was just such a special formative time for us. So that was probably the most life-shaping city that we've lived in. And now that we're back in Texas, it actually has informed the way that we seek out diversity even here.
That's beautiful. I took a trip with my daughters and the journalism class that I teach to New York City last spring. And I love just seeing so much influence of different cultures, different immigrant groups, some that have been there for generations, some more recent groups, and even how that shapes the cuisine that you get to try when you're in the city, how it shapes the way that, you know, storefronts look and things that are sold there. What an amazing place to live. And also so urban. So I want to learn a little more about this, because you had how many kids during that season of life?
So in Manhattan, I had 3 under 5 years old. And it is definitely a different environment of motherhood than I would say Texas. So
yeah. Okay. So tell me about some of those differences. I can guess, but what was that like for you?
Yeah. So at the beginning, I did not have a car in the city. So your stroller is your car, and you are strapping your children on you and praying as they scooter amongst a million cars passing by, you know, a few feet from where they're scootering, just praying that the Lord would protect them. So it took a lot of faith that they would survive by the end of the day. But honestly, I think what was so rich was being able to go visit museums and expose our kids to a world that was beyond them, right? A world that is bigger than just ourselves. And that was incredibly valuable.
I love that. Well, there's so much in that city. So I can only imagine that you daily had many field trip options with your little stroller.
Yes, you think about the different cuisines. You could go to Little Italy, or you could go up to Harlem. Depending on where you wanted to venture, you could have that cuisine that was pretty much just like visiting that country in a way. And it was something that I never took for granted. It was incredible.
So now you've got kids that are more teenagers and getting ready to launch one to college, and you're raising them in Texas. So just paint the contrast for us of the glory that you experience in Texas in this season.
I think at first it actually was challenging to have that cultural shift back where a lot of our family and friends have not lived elsewhere. And so there's been times it's felt isolating of wondering kind of where we fit in and recognizing that we get to share our cultural experiences now with people that we have come to love here. I think for especially my daughter launching, she's looking to go to school outside of Texas. She wants to go far and wide. And I think a lot of that has started with the language and our experiences of just reminding our kids that they are part of a bigger story, part of a bigger world, both with the books we've read, but the places we've lived. And I can see that even in the way that she's talking about school and that next chapter of her life.
So you and your husband have this ministry that really reaches out to families and couples, and it's called First Things First. And I want to know a little bit more about that. How would you describe First Things First to others?
Yeah. So First Things First was a ministry, as we say, that was lived in the trenches before it ever became public. And it is about our story in New York, how it birthed kind of our heart behind this ministry, that we first went to Manhattan to build our resumes and to simultaneously think about how it could build a life of comfort after the city, and that we would move after a few years and start a life somewhere else that was comfortable and then raise a family in that order. And God had different plans for us. So while we were in New York, we were offered an opportunity to plant a church and to actually stay in New York while we were raising a family. And so by God's grace, we kind of learned to just reject that notion that more space or more money or more comfort is a life worth pursuing. And so we decided, what would that look like for us to just come alongside others and help them realize that this life that's meaningful and rich doesn't necessarily come with more money or the picture that you think it will. And just wanting people to find joy in what it looks like to faithfully steward where God has you and what that looks like, even if it's different than what you expected.
So good. I love that phrase, faithful stewardship. And I've heard you talk about that before. I know you write about it. But as I have been talking about with my guests, this idea of crafting a life that glorifies God, where we get to see those glimpses of God's glory. I do think the heart of it is faithful stewardship. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what that might mean as we are crafting a life that would give God glory.
Yeah, I read a quote actually this week from Eugene Peterson in his book, Adorning the Dark, and I thought I would mention it here. And he says, stewardship is a matter of dedicating to God the world within our reach. And I loved that because when we think about just what has God given us to steward, which means to manage, right? That we are not fully owners of everything that he's given us, but that these gifts can be used not just for our own purposes, but for his glory. And I love, Dorina, how you always focus our gaze back to God's glory with what we've been given. That's the hard parts of our story, as well as the joyful parts of our stories. And so I think that even as we talk about travel and feasting, that those can be gifts that we have that can be used to steward for his glory and for worship. I think faithful stewardship sometimes makes us feel like, especially with our finances, that we need to be thrifty or we need to save. And so we feel guilty spending it on a good meal or on a trip. And I think that God is actually delighted when we delight in what he's given us. And so just to remember the joy that can be ours when we steward faithfully for his purposes, but that he delights when we delight in him. And so I think about that with traveling, that we have an opportunity to mirror God to this diverse world. That is a gift that's entrusted to us, that we get to travel and mirror him to others. And I think faithfully stewarding our resources in a way that allows us to travel is an investment in the greater kingdom of God.
I couldn't agree more. And I know for you and me, one of the reasons why I believe that we connected so quickly, we met on a retreat a few years ago, is that we started talking about travel and food and experiencing God through taste and what we saw through the world. And I know your family has prioritized travel as something that you value. Where are some of the places that you have traveled together, and how have you experienced God's glory in those places?
I mean, this is something we could talk about for a long time, but my husband and I have definitely traveled to more places than we have as a family of 6. I think we look at travel in kind of 3 different buckets, like travel as celebration, even travel as family. So we have family in London, and then even travel as service. And so as a family of 6, we have been able to leverage where we have family. And so our 2 big international trips as a family have been to visit family in London and then use that as a jumping off point to visit Paris, which is magical. And we actually are getting ready to have a Sullivan family Christmas in London this year. So we are leaving in December for another London trip, which never gets old, and getting to share that with our extended family will be very special. But I think being able to have conversations around like, what does that look like? And a lot of that starts with expectations, right? Of traveling as a family of 6 and stewarding that time well may look differently than if it was a girls' trip where you and your husband. So being realistic, I think, about financially, what does this cost? Planning ahead. But honestly, we have found it rewarding to even plan ahead, but sometimes not book until maybe more last minute. And there have been some great deals and discounts that we have found as a family. So I think leveraging kind of where you have family or relationships is a big way to steward, especially traveling as a family. And then I think about travel in terms of service. My husband and my daughter actually went to Guatemala together alongside a larger group. And so even if it's not all of us as a family, looking for ways that you can serve together. I do want to make a caveat point here. And that is, it doesn't always have to look like this big, glamorous international trip for it to be meaningful, family time or family memory. We are big road trip people. We have family all over the country. And so when I think of travel, I also think about just piling in our car and looking at a map along the way and helping stop at some historical points. But I think it can look as glamorous as an international trip, or it can be even just immersing yourself in cultures that are right around you. And all of those have been meaningful for our family.
I'm so glad that you brought that up. I grew up in a family where, we did a lot of camping and a lot of road trips, which was not spending a lot of money. It was, cooking over the campfire and going to national parks or going to some local types of campgrounds. And then it wasn't until I was in college that I did more international travel. And like you mentioned, the idea of traveling to get to serve in other places. And so I think those expectations of kind of understanding like, okay, is this a celebration trip? Is this a service trip? Even what our budget is going to look like when we go to those places, it's really important. And being on the same page with the people that you're traveling with, even if that's your kids or you're meeting up with people. But I also love the idea of kind of leveraging some of our relationships as a good jumping point. And I think that is such a great idea. It's also something my parents taught us is like, we actually travel so we can visit people. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to stay at their house, although lots of times people would offer us free housing and we would, sleep on the floor or bunk up or whatever that would entail, even if they didn't have some, fancy guest suite, that's okay. And other times maybe that means just going to a location where we have family or we have friends who are like family and staying in a hotel, but then, meeting up with them to do some of those cultural things. So there's lots of different ways I believe that we can experience travel, and it doesn't have to be so monetarily expensive in order to make those memories, like you said. So Are there any other places that are kind of on a bucket list for you as far as traveling with your whole family?
Yes. So we, like I said, traveling for celebration. In a few years, we will be married 25 years, and we kind of hit all these milestones. Like my daughter will be um, almost 21. My son will be 18, 16, and 12. So we have family, like I said, extended family that are in New Zealand. So we are praying and preparing now for potentially a big family trip to New Zealand. But I'll tell you, I mean, there is just so much that I love when you're traveling with your children, because it's more than just feeling entitled to a great experience, right? And I just think about, when I think about bucket lists, yes, there are places on the other end of the world I want to see, but there's also places that can connect the dots for our education. You know, I'm a homeschool mom, so I think about, what have the kids been studying? And let's go travel and let's go dive deeper into that culture, right? Where can we see these of an invisible God, but we can see his visible characteristics all over the world with experiences. I think New Zealand is for sure on our bucket list, probably South Africa at some point, but we just take it a day at a time. And I think even now, like I said, London is next, and we're really excited about it. So.
Well, I also believe that books are one of the ways that we can experience the world or prepare us for those trips that we're dreaming about in the future. And I know you are a reader. Obviously, you're an educator. You've talked a bit about that. So do you have any books that you would recommend, especially for travelers or for foodies, since we're talking about food and travel today?
I love that. You know, when I think about what books get me the most excited, I think about Bread and Wine by Shawna Sullivan, because I realize that it's these stories of these recipes that we're making. And anywhere we travel, I buy a cookbook. And so it may not be a book that you would want to go and buy, but I just would encourage, wherever you travel, think about buying a cookbook almost as a souvenir, because then that becomes something that you can constantly revisit. Or we've bought spices before to bring back so that we can try to replicate that at home. I think for my kids, so I do have a camera, so I'm going to show you, but it is this book, Food Anatomy. It's darling and beautifully illustrated, but it has been fun for our kids to just explore the different types of food. And I love the way that she does it. So when I thought about what's a book I would recommend, especially if you're a mom or thinking about wanting to instill a love of feasting with your family, that has been a fun one. Even books about missionaries, thinking about before you go visit a place, reading a book that's set in that geographical location. So there have been some missionary books that we've read that have just been really exciting and helpful for our kids to have a frame of reference before we enter that culture. So even though it's not a specific one, that's a genre of books that sometimes we overlook as just being a great way to experience another culture even before you travel.
Oh, those are some great ideas. I actually talked about this a little bit with our friend Krista Gilbert in episode 8. And that is also her practice, that when she travels, she buys a cookbook. I am not really a collector person, but the one thing I do have a collection of are cookbooks from around the world. And I think it's such a fun way to even later go back and kind of revisit, you know, some of the things that you got to eat or some of the experiences that you had in a certain city or in a certain country. So I love that idea, but I haven't heard the idea of reading about missionaries from that geographical location. That's a really good one.
I think it helps our kids also picture that these are not just geographical areas that we're going to consume, right? But that when we go and we're stewarding our resources faithfully to visit them, we're also supporting that culture. We're supporting that community. And I just love that it gives them a bigger picture of why we travel. And it's not only about us.
And just that we don't have that posture of just being consumers, but even supporters. And we're in the posture of what can I learn and take away from this culture, take home with me. It's such a beautiful way, I think, to be good stewards. Well, this is just kind of a fun and more practical question. Do you have any favorite items that you like to take with you when you go travel? Any fun hacks or something that you take with you to have as like a little luxury in your bag?
I am big on moisturizing. This is not like a big hack. It's just I cannot go anywhere without my Kiehl's hand cream, and a really good lip balm of some kind. I feel like, we try to research time zones and, so that we can intentionally plan. This is really big for us. We intentionally plan, especially when you're traveling with children, when to let them sleep and when to stay awake so that when you hit the ground, you are ready to go. I wrote a blog post a few years ago just about my favorite travel tips with children, because I think, for us, like, we can typically, I think we can be accommodating to what we need when we travel, but for our children, it's a little trickier. And so I always think about finding one new item for them to enjoy on a plane that they've never seen before. So whether it's a new book, a new toy, something new a new game that they can experience for a flight, that has served me well, whether visiting family that's far away or doing an international trip. So.
Oh, great advice. I love that. Okay, well, as we wrap up today, Shawna, I could talk to you about some of this for hours, but I want you to think about, what is a meal that you have tasted in a different city or a different country that is really memorable to you, that's just tasting the glory of God?
I love that. I had several come to mind, but one main one is, even before we had children, my husband and I went to Italy and we visited this winery. We happened to be there, I believe it was in September. We visited this winery and it included this meal, and it was a 6-course meal with all of these strangers. And the meal was incredible. I mean, you can imagine the flavors and all of the homemade pasta. I mean, it was just incredible. But what stood out to me the most was that we were there during a week of harvest for them. And they had brought the grapes that they had just picked, and they wanted us to taste the grapes that eventually they would make into wine. But the entire ambiance of the vineyard, I mean, everyone was celebrating. It was so joy-filled. And here we sat down with probably 12 other strangers. And by the end of the meal, not only were we all friends, but I remember tasting that sweet grape so vividly. And this is over 17 years ago.
Wow.
And I think it's just this reminder of, just as Galatians 6:9 reminds us, like, we will have a harvest if we do not grow weary in doing good. And that little grape, it was bursting with flavor. But even though we had had this whole feast, that little grape just reminded me of the harvest. And I immediately, when I was thinking about this question, I thought, oh, that grape is something that I always think about. And it reminds me of the fruit of our labor and our faithful living here and now.
Oh, it's so beautiful. I feel like my mouth is watering right now, even as you are just describing that. And what a beautiful picture of how we get to taste and see the glory of God. Thank you so much for sharing that. And thanks for being here on the podcast today, Shawna.
Thank you.
Take care. Wasn't that such a helpful and inspiring conversation with Shawna Sullivan? I just love her perspective. And, she has been instrumental in helping me think about how I can steward wisely. And now is really the best time to start planning wisely for the things that you value and want to invest in the new year. So that includes travel, that includes feasting, and all the things we talked about today on the podcast. Shawna has put together a special New Year's guide to help pace our spending and to help us align with our values. And we are going to share that in the show notes. You can check that out. I also wanted to share our 3 GGC recommendations. The first is a book that Shawna mentioned in our conversation called Bread and Wine, and it happens to also be one of my favorite books. You can see this one has all the tabs in there because I actually do use the recipes in this book, but it is part food and spiritual memoir and part recipe book or cookbook. And I want to just share with you the opening to the book as our featured book for this episode. This is by Shauna Niequist, one of my favorite authors, and the subtitle is A Love Letter to Life Around the Table with Recipes. So here is the author's note, kind of introduction that she has for us, and it's an invitation into Shauna's beautiful writing. It says, I'm a bread person, Crusty, golden baguette, hearty, grainy, seeded loaves, thin, crispy pizza crust, all of it. Flaky, buttery croissants, chewy pita, tortillas, warm and fragrant, blistered by heat. Whenever my jeans are too tight, I'm reminded that I know better than to love bread the way I do. But love is blind and certainly beyond reason. And I am a wine person. The blood red and liquid gold, the clink and glamour of tall stemmed glasses, and the musty, rich, almost mushroomy smell. More than that, I am a bread and wine person. And by that, I mean that I'm a Christian, a person of the body and blood, a person of the bread and wine. Like every Christian, I recognize the two as food and drink. And also, at the very same time, I recognize them as something much greater, mystery and tradition and symbol. Bread is bread and wine is wine, but bread and wine is another thing entirely. The two together are the sacred and the material at once, the heaven and earth, the divine and the daily. This is a collection of essays about my family, friendships, and the meals that bring us together. It's about the ways God teaches and nourishes us as we nourish the people around us, and about hunger, both physical and otherwise, and the connections between the two. So, friends, I hope you will check out this beautiful book, Bread and Wine, that was recommended by Shawna. And as I mentioned, one of my favorites also graces my cookbook collection shelf that I have here at home. Shawna also mentioned a book called Food Anatomy, The Curious Parts and Pieces of Our Edible World by Julia Rothman. And this is a beautiful book that's actually new to me. So this is our second recommendation for this episode. It is an illustrated book by an award-winning food journalist, and it's just beautiful the way that she unfolds this history of food, and she ends with a global tour of street eats. So I highly recommend that one as well. We have a link in the comments, and our third Global Glory Chasers recommendation for today also comes from Shawna Sullivan. She mentioned the idea, and she's a homeschooling mama, that you read about some different missionaries or Christian heroes from the locations where you might be visiting with your family. And so there's a series that she recommends called Christian Heroes Then and Now, and there's all different books. I see here a set of 5 different books, and I'm going to link these in the comments, but these exciting, challenging, and deeply touching true stories chronicle the lives of ordinary men and women whose trust in God accomplished extraordinary exploits for his kingdom and his glory. And it's written specifically to challenge readers with the powerful lives of these missionaries. So that's such a fun idea, especially if you have younger kids and if you want some read alouds for before you leave on a trip or even while you are on a road trip. Friends, thank you for joining us today for Season 5, Episode 11 of the Global Glory Chasers podcast, which is made possible and ad-free by my generous supporters through Substack. Now, I have a newsletter over on Substack, which is called my Glorygram. It is free for subscribers, and there's also an option to become a paid subscriber. In other words, to donate towards this good work and to support the podcast. And as a paid subscriber, you will receive my special 4-part Advent devotional, which I write every year. It's one of my favorite things to share with my readers. And this year's theme is See God Move. So if you are interested in that, hop over to dorinaglorygram.substack.com. You can also review my podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Those reviews go a long way in helping me to multiply this message and share it with others. We're going to be right back here next Wednesday to drop our next episode of Global Glory Chasers. And this will be our final episode of Season 5. I'm so excited for my friend Kathy Lipp to come on the show and share about her new book, Sabbath Soup. Friends, let's keep chasing God's glory together.